Thanks for taking part in the Wrexham.com General Election 29 Q&A video. So we'll dive straight in. Are you able to tell us a little about who you are, any political history, and about why you have the political leanings that you do?
I've been involved in either political or charity work for most of my working life, and even now, having taken early retirement from the job that I was doing. And I suppose it's because I've always had a leaning towards doing things which are not necessarily working for a profit-based company, for example, but actually trying to put something back into the community. That's certainly the case with the charity work I did with things like Oxfam. And in political terms, I come from the generation that was very into things like CND. In fact, I even worked for them at one time when I was younger. And latterly, I was working for the charity Oxfam in London as one of their education officers. And so it was natural for me to look to politics as another interest that I would have, and as a means for me to think about doing things for the community and in the community. As part of that, I was a member of the Labour Party for quite some time. I very much fell out of love with them in the 1990s due to things like, the 2000s rather, I should say, due to things like the Iraq War, which I was totally opposed to, and many other areas where I felt that the Labour Party was becoming more like a pale imitation of the Tory Party. And after a while out of politics, I finally ended up in the Green Party, which is where I am now.
Thank you. Locality of candidates is one debate we've spotted people mentioning, perhaps more so in this election than ever before. Do you think it's important that people are represented by those who live and work in their communities?
Yes, I do think it's important, although I'm aware that particularly in general elections you do sometimes get, particularly with some parties I have to say, people travelling quite a long way from where their home might be to stand in a particular constituency. As for myself, I've lived and worked in Wrexham now for just over 24 years. I moved here from London, where I worked and lived for about 18 years. I was born and brought up in Cardiff, so I think I have good roots in Wales, my family does. And as far as Wrexham's concerned, as I say, yes, I've lived in the county borough for 24 years now. You
mentioned distance there, and there are obviously candidates with varying distance. You've previously stood in Allen and Deeside. Is that kind of the top end of that distance, or how would you see that?
Well, the Allen and Deeside situation was obviously for lots of reasons very, very unusual, and we weren't able to find a candidate from that particular constituency, and as I lived in a neighbouring constituency, I was selected as the candidate. Yeah.
And we're going to ask this to everybody who stood for MP and AM, but which one would you prefer to be, an MP or an AM?
I think there are many reasons why aspiring politicians might want to be either of those two things. I think personally I would probably go on the side of the AM role, and the reason for that is because I've always supported Welsh devolution anyway, and I think it's a very exciting time in prospect now for Wales as far as the devolution settlement is concerned, as we move towards something which is much more like being a Welsh government than simply the assembly that we've had so far, and that's going to include things like the Welsh government having tax raising powers, so that Wales will become more and more able to decide its own destiny, and I think therefore that's a really important and exciting time for people with political ideas and motives to become involved in Welsh politics.
Just to wrap up on the candidate questions from that perspective, there was an election in 2017, but there was no Green candidate in Wrexham. I don't believe there was one in Clwyd South either. Does that mean that there was no climate emergency back then, or any big issues that were worth standing for?
Far from it. We would have loved to have stood candidates in both of the elections that you mentioned. However, the Green Party is not a rich party. It doesn't have the kind of funding sources like the Tory Party and the Labour Party does, with big businesses and trade unions. We rely almost entirely on our membership and things like legacies to keep us going. And therefore it is difficult when you get a lot of elections coming along one after the other, and I can say quite clearly that would have been a lot of things that we would have wanted to address had we stood in those elections, but having stood in a lot of the local seats in 2015, we simply couldn't afford it on that occasion.
Thank you. If you were representing Wrexham at Prime Minister Questions today, what question would you ask the Prime Minister, and what would you hope to uncover with it?
Well, I have to say that I'm one of the people who basically doesn't trust our current Prime Minister very much. Mr Johnson, I feel, is entirely unreliable, and he's shown himself to be so in many, many instances over the last few months since he became Prime Minister. So therefore, and because it's such an important issue, I think what I would like to try and get out of him is what his real intentions regarding Brexit are, because that is clearly an absolutely vital issue for the country, and we simply don't know what is going to happen there. There's a suspicion, I think, amongst many of us that he and his colleagues are still perfectly accepting the idea that we might crash out of the EU without any deal, involving all the damage economically and socially and to our communities that would cause for our country. And so my question to him would be, will you be honest and tell us what your plans are for Brexit? I don't think I would get a positive reply though.
This is the third election in 4 years. People consistently say they're fed up obviously with politics, party politics, especially politicians. You're all the same, that kind of thing, they never listen anyway. What would be different about you?
Well, I can see why people might feel like that. When the Fixed Term Parliament Act was brought in, we were told that we'd be having an election every 5 years. We're now having our third election in around about that amount of time. I think one of the factors that weighs very heavily here is that people are starting to lose trust in their politicians. They don't feel they're being represented by the politicians that they're electing. And one of the key things here, as far as we're concerned in the Green Party, is that we must have a fairer system of democratic representation. Just to give you one example, the Green Party has one MP in Westminster, that's Caroline Lucas, and she's one MP. We had 1.2 million votes in the 2015 election altogether. So you could say it took us 1.2 million votes to get one MP elected. Now, in the case of the Labour Party, the Tory Party, they have hundreds of MPs elected with only a relatively small amount more people electing them. So clearly there's a democratic deficit there, and in almost every constituency you look in, including Wrexham, include South and most of the other Welsh constituencies, you will find that the MP or Assembly member who gets elected is usually elected on the minority with the vote. In other words, the majority of people in those constituencies are not represented by an MP who comes from their particular political persuasion. And I think we need to change that. We need to change it by bringing in more proportional representation, which would give parties like ourselves, who get a lot of votes but not necessarily coming first in every first past the post election, it would give us a chance to represent the people who support us better.
Speaking of changing things, now I'm not talking manifesto items, as hopefully the parties can sort those out themselves. As an MP, you might get a chance to bring in a new law via a private member's bill. If you had that opportunity, what law would you perhaps seek to bring in?
Well, I think to hark back to what we've just been talking about, the one I would most like to see, because it would have the greatest impact on Parliament and the representation of the people, is to look at our electoral system and bring in a bill to change the electoral system so that we have a system, yes, of constituency representation, because I think that is important, that there should be members representing particular geographical areas, but on top of that, there should be proportional representation for regional-wide MPs to stand. And in fact, we're already doing that, of course, in Wales with the regional list system for the Welsh Assembly, so that we have constituency AMs and we have regional AMs, and I think that would be a good example for the Westminster Parliament to follow.
What relevant experience do you think you've got for the job of MP?
Right, I think in my case, I'm well grounded, obviously, in the whole area of current affairs, politics. If you work for an organisation like Oxfam, for example, which I did, although Oxfam is a charity, a lot of the issues that it has to grapple with, and a lot of the people who are adversely affected, which they're trying to help, it's happening because of political decisions which have been taken by various governments around the world. Also, I spent 21 years working for the Co-op in its membership and PR department, and that involved a lot of work with local communities, including helping local communities that were struggling with various different issues and pointing them in directions of funding, that sort of thing. And I think that kind of experience is invaluable for anybody who aspires to be a politician, because you've got to understand local communities, what their needs are, and how best to address them.
Aside from Brexit, which we'll come on to later on, what do you feel is the top issue for Wrexham in the forthcoming parliamentary term, and how would you like to see your desired outcome achieved on it?
Okay. Well, I thought a bit about this before coming here, and obviously I've thought about it as part of the campaign. And if it's okay, I'm actually going to list three things. One of them is the NHS, which is clearly something of huge importance to everybody, whoever we are, whatever age we are, whatever situation we're in. It's very important, and I would be the first to say that at the moment the NHS is not delivering what people need and want, and so measures to address that would be one big priority for me. The second is public transport, where I think there needs to be a massive investment in things like rail services, bus services, and facilities for pedestrians and cyclists, so that people can get about, get active in some cases, and actually do the sort of activity which is going to help them to avoid the adverse effects of inactivity. And the third thing is the issue of the basic minimum wage. Or universal living wage, as we're calling it in the Green Party, which actually forms a part of our wider aspirations to deal with the subject of climate change, but I might come on to that later. And the idea there is to try and address the issue of what we call the working poor. To anybody that's familiar with the food bank operation, that refers to the situation where you have many people. We're talking about millions of parcels being handed out in food banks across the country now, including many in Wrexham. And it's the issue that a lot of the people who are using this kind of facility, they're not people who are out of work, they're people who are in work but who don't have sufficient income to cover their needs. And so therefore what we would be proposing is an increase in the basic minimum wage to create a living wage for everybody, and similar advances in things like pensions and so on. And so those would be the main ones that I would highlight.
We were going to ask a question based around that in terms of, is there a struggle to explain to people what your party stands for aside from green issues? Do you think there is an inability to kind of get through to that element of the manifesto?
I think in terms of the issues that we're addressing, a lot of the parties are actually saying that they're addressing the same issues, and we're no different with regard to some of those things. For example, with the NHS, I don't think there's any party which doesn't say that the NHS is a priority, but there are some huge differences in the way that we approach it. For example, in the Green Party, we're not under any illusions. We know that we're not spending enough, and we actually think we need to invest a further £6 billion every year on a regular basis to actually bring the NHS up to anywhere near where it ought to be. For example, the yardstick that we would be using is somewhere close to our European neighbours in Scandinavia and Central Europe, which we're lagging well behind at the moment. And we'd also, in addition to that, propose things like a £1 billion investment in training new nurses, more money for doctors, all that kind of thing. And I think maybe because they have other priorities or because they're not seeing things clearly enough, a lot of the other parties will talk the talk as far as the health service is concerned, but they can't actually deliver on it because they haven't got the policies.
You've touched on climate, etc. Are you able to explain what the climate emergency means to you and why the people of Wrexham should be concerned by it?
Before saying anything more about it, I'll give you a simple sort of example. I've got two boys aged 24 and 26, and I've known about the dangers of climate change for quite some time, as have many scientists. So that, nobody can say they've not been being warned about it. And I used to think at one time, that one of the reasons I had to be active and passionate about the issue of climate change was because one day my boys or their children, if they had any, were going to have to deal with this, and I didn't feel it was fair, for us to leave that legacy to the generation that we were bringing up. And it's a chilling thought now for me, with hopefully a good few years still left to me, to think that actually it's not going to be something that only my children's generation are going to have to grapple with. It's something that we're all going to have to grapple with, because if you look around the world and if you look around this country, you can see the evidence of global warming and climate change cropping up almost everywhere. And if you listen to the scientific advice, and it's pretty unanimous now, there's been a panel of scientists recently, 11,000 of them, who issued a very stark warning that climate change was happening, that it was getting worse, and that action needed to be taken now. And that's the scientists talking. And I think we have to heed that, and I think urgent action is required. that means in the case of this country, we've got to look towards a target of being carbon neutral by the year 2030. That is only just over 10 years away. A lot of work to be done.
You mentioned a negative legacy if action's not taken there. What kind of day-to-day changes would affect the people of Wrexham, say, in 2030 if such action wasn't taken?
There are many of them. I could give you a few examples. I mean, for a start, we need to complete the process of exiting from the whole fossil fuels business, and one of the corollaries of that would be that we need to invest elsewhere, whether it's in offshore wind farms, which we already have plenty of off the North Wales coast, or alternative forms of energy generation which are sustainable and which are not going to create a bigger carbon footprint. So that is one thing that we can do. Immediately on our doorstep, and linking to one of the things that we've already touched on, take transport, for example. Transport in the form of cars, lorries and other diesel engine vehicles is a huge contributor towards the carbon footprint of this country. Now on the railways, for example, the carbon footprint has been greatly lessened through electrification of railway lines. And in England and Scotland, this has taken place over a wide range of routes amounting to many thousands of miles. In Wales, we have precisely 0 mileage of electrified railway track at the moment. They're just struggling to get the first of it into Cardiff at present, but it's going no further than that, despite the government having said it would go to Swansea. So what that means is that we're stuck with noisy, dirty, polluting diesel trains going up and down the line, including here in Wrexham, and they're going to be with us for some time because decisions weren't taken when they should have been. Those decisions could be taken now, and there are steps that could be taken to improve that.
You mentioned railways and fossil fuels there. I noticed on your profile you mentioned that you volunteer on the Llangollen to Culwyn Railway, which appears to be, I don't know locomotives very well, but it appears to be steam driven, burning fossil fuels, but that's tourism based, non-functional, if you know what I mean, for transport purposes railway. Isn't that a bit odd for a Green candidate?
No, I don't think so really. The impact of the steam locomotives on railways like Llangollen, heritage railways, they're generally called, and there are quite a lot of them, both in Wales and especially in the rest of the UK. The carbon footprint of the smoke emissions that those locomotives make is absolutely infinitesimally small, compared to any of the other things which are really, creating not just an unpleasant environment, but real dangers to people's health, like the emissions from diesel vehicles on the roads, heavy lorries. Many towns, both in Wales and in England, have been declared to be not only unsafe but illegal under the pollution regulations that we're supposed to be operating under, and so compared to that, railway like Llangollen Corwyn is very insignificant. Incidentally, we do also operate diesel trains, which are slightly better than the steam locomotives, but neither of them make a major impact.
The manifesto for the Green Party's come out today.
Yes.
I'm reading through it. It pledges 100,000 new council homes a year. And locally it's not council homes on the plans, but there are plans for large-scale new housing developments on greenfield sites around Wrexham. The manifesto does say that it would allocate cash to councils for the creation of houses, so in theory it could happen in Wrexham. What's your understanding of the need for housing in Wrexham, and if it is needed, where would you see these houses being built?
We haven't done a comprehensive study of this, but we are aware that there are two great needs. One is the refurbishment of existing stock, whether it's social housing or other housing that people are living in. The other is that in order to fit in with our kind of targets for decarbonisation, a lot of the housing stock, whether it's owner-occupied, whether it's social housing, council housing, whatever it is, needs to be retrofitted with measures like solar panels that can help the progress towards decarbonisation. And there's also an urgent need to, rather than having developers simply building where they can and taking what money they can from those developments, is to have properly affordable homes for people to buy being developed, and for that to be a very specific aim of the developers. And some organisations such as housing associations locally are actually starting to do more work on that, which I think is a good thing.
You mentioned essentially improving housing stock in a move to meet those targets. There's a perception that Green Party initiatives could increase the cost of living for households already in tight budgets. Is that the reality? And do you think that society benefits would win against people's purses when it came down to it?
Well, I think society and community benefits would win, yes, but we don't accept the argument that there would be a negative financial impact upon families because the programme that we're proposing, which amounts to £100 billion every year to actually tackle climate change, which is an enormous amount of money, it actually includes a lot of the things that we've just been talking about. So, for example, improving the housing stock and making it more efficient in terms of gathering energy or insulation, things like all of that would be counted into the money that we plan to spend on decarbonising ourselves by the year 2030. And I think we've got to remember that all the kind of things that we're proposing, whatever negative spin-off people might think they would be counteracted by a much more positive spin-off in other ways. So, for example, if people are living in houses which are warm and well insulated, not damp, not difficult to live in, then those are going to be more contented, more healthy people. If people are able to be more active because of measures that have been taken to improve public transport, cycling, pedestrian routes, all that sort of thing, then again, people are going to become more mobile and more able to get about, but also more active. And the sum effect of that is going to be a knock-on effect on the National Health Service, because if we have a healthy, happy society, then we are not going to have so many hospital admissions, either for long-term care or for emergency treatment.
You've touched on, I suppose, residential there, and the, as you said, enormous £100 billion a year investment promoting the transition, I suppose. Roughly 10% of that is going to be funded by raising corporation tax from 19 to 24%. What would be your argument for, say, the businesses on the high street and small businesses in the area that would kind of take part of that tax hike?
I think we would accept that there's a strong case for small and medium-sized businesses being treated differently in this sort of situation. I think there would have to be flexibility because those kind of businesses are vital, for example, to a place like Wrexham town centre, and we've all seen how that town centre has become almost like a ghost town in certain parts in recent years. And we certainly want to encourage smaller businesses to take a stake in improving that environment. So I think that the brunt of these kind of tax increases would have to be applied to the big corporations, the ones who are earning the most money, the ones whose shareholders are earning the most money, and to be honest, the ones who are best able to avoid having to pay as much tax as they should. Not accusing anybody of deliberately, illegally cheating on their tax, but there is tax avoidance going on, there's no doubt about it, and that could actually save an awful lot. The other things that we plan as part of our programme also include bringing things back into public hands. For example, the railways, Network Rail, which runs the tracks, the infrastructure signalling, all the rest of it, that's already publicly owned, has been ever since the railways were privatised. So it's only the railway companies that operate the trains, which are actually operated by private operators, and their main priority, to be honest, is to derive profit for their investors. It's not to actually improve the railway system in this country, which could be done much better if we had the train operation and the track and infrastructure operation controlled under one body, as it used to be under British Rail.
Looking at the manifesto, obviously mentions bits about changing the democratic system a bit. We've touched on that before. The Green Party's also got a green guarantee. One of it, part 9, was the citizens' democracy. It's got a statement on that, referring that politics should be done by people and not to them, and that decisions made nationally and locally are based on genuine consultation, negotiation and accountability. But there's a Unite to Remain electoral pact with 3 parties, Lib Dems, Greens, Plaid, across 60 constituencies, 11 in Wales as well. Surely that's politics being done to us with no accountability. Was there a consultation with you, and does that match that guarantee in your view?
Well, two things on that. First of all, as far as the Unite to Remain agreement was concerned, that was discussed at a fairly high level between representatives from the Green Party, Plaid Cymru and Liberal Democrats. I'm not sure what the other parties' processes were, but in the case of the Green Party, every single constituency where we would have been standing a candidate, which that affected, had to have its own discussion about the proposal, and if the local party, the local Green Party, was not in agreement with it, then it would not have happened. So we were very clear that in our case the decision would lie in the hands of our local party. We regard this as very much a one-off. It's to deal with a very specific, very unusual, unlikely to ever occur again situation, which is the issue of Brexit and the issue of whether there is going to be a confirmatory vote for people to decide whether they want to Brexit or whether they, after all due consideration, would prefer to stay. And we certainly do not see this as setting any kind of precedent, especially as we have such fundamental disagreements with both Liberal Democrats and Plaid Cymru on so many issues.
On Brexit, how did you vote in the referendum, and have you changed your position since?
Well, I hope I don't look too old in saying this, but I'm actually old enough to have voted in both referendums on Europe. And I actually voted a different way on both occasions. So in 1975, I voted against, I voted for leaving what was then the common market. This time round, I voted to stay, to remain.
In terms of that, was that remain or remain with changes to the EU?
Oh, very definitely remain with changes. That was always my position as it evolved through the course of us belonging to the EU. But I was pleased to say that the Green Party took that position as well. It's basically to say remain because we can see so many positive advantages and benefits for this country in being part of the EU bloc, but remain with a complete revision really of EU democracy. Just to give a few examples, I think the European Parliament and the European Commission need to be far more transparent. It needs to be far easier for people to find out what's going on there. People need to have better contacts with the European MPs. And that whole process, I think, it just has to be much more open and more available to public scrutiny. At the moment, I think a lot of people, judging from the things they say, don't know anything about what is going on there. And I would freely admit myself that I could do with knowing a lot more. But I think that's the key thing, to get more people involved and, in a way, a bit like our own democratic system, for the structure to be a bit less top-down and a bit more coming up from the grassroots.
In terms of that, Green Party pledges to campaign for Remain on a people's vote. Wrexham clearly voted leave, and that decision's obviously not been carried out. Surely that's the ultimate in being undemocratic, to then look to rerun it.
Well, I'm not quite so sure that's the case. Our position is we don't support the Liberal Democrats' position of simply saying that they want to cancel Article 50 and revoke and leave just like that. Because our view is that you have to respect the views of both the people who voted to leave the EU and those who voted to remain. Because although the leave vote did win, it was a fairly narrow win, and it effectively left us with a country divided, especially when you take into account the approximately a third of the electorate who didn't even bother to vote at all. It certainly wasn't a majority of the electorate. And I think that you have to think that both the people who voted Remain and the people that voted Leave did have real reasons why they were voting in that way. In a way, perhaps the people who voted Leave had more reasons because the people who voted Remain were maybe just saying, okay, well, we'll stay as we are. But if you're proposing actually leaving something and doing something totally different, then maybe you've got more issues that you're thinking about when you make that choice. And we totally respect the fact that people who voted to leave would have had many reasons for wanting to leave. Some of them may have been connected directly with things that was happening in the EU. Some of them could have been perhaps related to things that are happening in this country, but which are not necessarily down to the EU. And it could be that some of those things, the people should be protesting at their own governments and their own MPs rather than to the EU. But whichever way you look at it, we feel that an enormous amount has been learned by everybody, certainly including me and a lot of people I know, about the EU and about Brexit and about the whole situation since the referendum took place. A lot of things that we weren't told back in 2016, a lot of things which to be frank, people were lying about at the time, and I think we now have a lot more clarity about what would be involved in if we did leave the EU, and what the reasons, what the beneficial reasons are that there might be for staying. And there's a certain amount of polling evidence, I think, to show that the actual margins have now shifted a bit, so that some polls are showing that there is actually now a Remain majority amongst the population. So I think there's a very good case for taking it back to the people, not least because we have such a toxic political atmosphere in this country now, and we've got to find some way of trying to mend that. And I think having a confirmatory referendum is one way of doing that, providing that you have on the ballot paper a viable option for leaving, which those who want to leave could vote for, obviously, and a viable option for remaining within the EU. One more point I'd like to make, and that is that whilst the referendum clearly had a sort of implementation element attached to it, that it would be implemented. Obviously, and as I said, I don't think it was explained properly, but it isn't the case that everything that people want, or everything that there is a majority for Parliament doing, is automatically accepted. And I'll give you the example of the death penalty. There have been numerous polls in this country since the death penalty was abolished in the 1960s, many of them showing that the people in this country would vote for it to be reinstated. But I, for one, am glad that MPs in Parliament have had the courage to actually take the humane view and say that we're not going to have that kind of barbaric punishment in this country. And it's an example of where MPs have actually taken responsibility for a huge issue and decided to go against the will of some of the people because they think it's important. So I'm not saying that should happen all the time, but it's something that can happen.
Thank you very much. Have you got anything else to add for potential voters watching this?
Yeah, I think we've covered a lot of the general wider issues quite well, and dealt with some things to do with Wrexham. I'd just like to come back to the issue of the climate emergency, because although we've got this issue of global warming and the climate emergency it's causing, and there are towns up and down the country now that have declared climate emergencies, including Wrexham, I think. And now the time has now come, frankly, to do something about it, and that's why we've tied most of our policies into the climate emergency, because if you look at them and the costing of them and the implications of them, you'll find that most of them are in some way building towards that achievement of the net carbon zero by 2030. And one of my colleagues is actually Caroline Lucas, who was asked a question about this recently, and she put it really well. And I'd finish on this, which is that we're told that we have a climate emergency, and yet the positions of the other political parties, and this includes the Labour Party, which has recently indicated its plan to row back on its commitment to have carbon zero by 2030, incidentally. So other political parties seem to be taking the attitude with the climate emergency. It's a bit like you ring up the emergency services and ask for a fire engine in 30 years' time. Well, that's not commensurate with what I understand an emergency to be. And that, I think, sums up our attitude towards climate change. And that's the overarching thing that I think affects us all.
Thank you very much for your time, and hopefully see you in the debate early December as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.